The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. on October 15, 1940. Flight Lieutenant James Brindley Nicholson's Hurricane sat on the rain-slicked runway at RAF Martlesham Heath, engine idling. The order was clear: scramble immediately. Radar stations along the coast had detected a large formation of German bombers crossing the Channel, heading straight for London. Nicholson's squadron was supposed to intercept them together. 12 Hurricanes rising as one unit to attack the bomber stream. That was doctrine. That was procedure. Fighter Command had learned hard lessons over the past 3 months of the Blitz. Solo attacks on bomber formations were suicide. The German bombers flew in tight defensive boxes, their machine guns covering every approach angle. You needed numbers to break through, but Nicholson's Hurricane was the only one ready. The rest of his squadron was still scrambling, pilots running across the dark airfield, ground crews frantically trying to get engines started. Mechanical issues, fuel problems, the chaos of a night scramble at a forward base. The sector controller's voice came through his headset again, more urgent this time. The bomber formation was 17 minutes from London. Current track would take them directly over the East End, the docks, the industrial districts, where thousands of civilians huddled in shelters and underground stations. Nicholson looked down the runway. No other aircraft rolling, no wingmen climbing to join him. Just him, one Hurricane, and a formation of German bombers that outnumbered him at least 20-1. His orders were to climb and maintain combat air patrol until the rest of the squadron formed up. Then they'd attack together, sensible, tactical, by the book. But by the time his squadron assembled, those bombers would be over London, dropping their payloads on civilians who'd already endured weeks of nightly terror. 17 minutes. That's all the time those people had. Nicholson pushed the throttle forward and released the brakes. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about solo intercepts during this desperate period of the war. James Brindley Nicolson was 23 years old and had been flying combat missions for exactly 4 months. He joined RAF Fighter Command in May 1940, right as the situation in France collapsed and Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. He wasn't one of the glamorous Battle of Britain aces with dozens of kills. He'd shot down 2 German aircraft in 4 months of combat, respectable but unremarkable. What he was, though, was exceptionally stubborn. His instructors at flight school had noted it in his evaluations. Nicholson displays determination that borders on recklessness, does not abandon objectives easily. His squadron commander had written something similar. Excellent pilot, perhaps too committed too, completing missions regardless of risk. Tonight, that stubbornness was about to be tested. The Hurricane climbed through the darkness, its Merlin engine roaring at full power. Nicholson leveled off at 18,000 feet and turned southeast toward the reported position of the German formation. The night was clear, unusual for October. Moonlight reflected off the channel below, turning the water silver. At 18,000 feet in October, the temperature was well below freezing. Ice formed on his canopy, despite the Hurricane's heating system. His breath fogged the inside of his oxygen mask. His hands were already numb, even inside his flying gloves. The radio crackled, the sector controller updating his position. The German formation had been positively identified. 23 Heinkel He 111 bombers flying in 3 tight Vics of 7, plus 2 stragglers. Heavy bomb loads, heading 310, speed 180 knots, altitude 16,000 feet. Nicholson did the mathematics in his head. 23 bombers meant potentially 46 machine gunners. Each Heinkel carried a crew of 5 with multiple defensive positions. If they were in proper formation, their fields of fire overlapped, creating a web of tracers that could shred any fighter foolish enough to approach head-on or from above. Standard tactics called for attacking from below and behind, diving through the formation, firing and breaking away before the gunners could track you. but that required multiple fighters attacking simultaneously to split the defensive fire. One fighter attacking alone would draw every gun in the formation. The sector controller's voice again. Vector 090. Bandits now 12 miles ahead, your altitude plus 2,000. Nicholson spotted them a moment later. Dark shapes against the moonlit sky. The bombers looked like a swarm of insects, their formations tight and disciplined. He counted quickly, 23, just as reported. They were slightly above him, giving them an advantage. The defensive gunners would see him coming from below. Behind him, 60 miles away, his squadron was finally getting airborne. The controller was vectoring them toward the bomber stream. They'd arrive in approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, those bombers would be over the Thames Estuary, 3 minutes from their drop point. The civilians below would have no warning beyond the air raid sirens that were probably already wailing across East London. Nicholson had two choices. He could maintain his position, shadow the bombers, report their exact location, and wait for his squadron to arrive. Together, they'd tear into the formation with overwhelming force. That was the smart play, the tactical play. The play that would keep him alive, or he could attack now, alone, one Hurricane against 23 bombers and their collective firepower. The attack would be largely symbolic. One fighter couldn't stop a formation this size, but he might scatter them, break up. Their tight formation forced them to maneuver. Scattered bombers were less accurate. Bombers forced to take evasive action dropped their payloads early or missed their targets entirely. Every minute he could delay them, every bit of chaos he could create meant fewer bombs landing on target, fewer civilians killed in their homes, fewer children buried under rubble. Nicholson checked his ammunition. 8 Browning machine guns, approximately 15 seconds of firing time. The Hurricane's guns were reliable, deadly accurate, but 15 seconds wasn't much against 23 aircraft. The bomber formation droned on toward London, seemingly unaware of the single fighter climbing toward them from below. Nicholson armed his guns and pushed the throttle to combat power. The attack began at 12:04 a.m., 17 miles southeast of London. Nicholson came up from below and behind, targeting the rear Vic of 7 bombers. His approach was nearly perfect, using the darkness and the blind spot beneath the Heinkel's fuselages. He closed to 200 yards before the first German gunner spotted him. Tracers immediately filled the air. Bright streams of 7.92 made machine gun fire reaching out toward him like deadly fingers. Nicholson jinked left, then right, spoiling their aim while maintaining his attack vector. The Hurricane shuddered as rounds impacted the fuselage, punching through the thin aluminum skin. He selected his target, the leftmost bomber in the rear Vic, and opened fire. All 8 Brownings hammered simultaneously, their combined roar drowning out the Merlin engine. Tracers walked across the Heinkel's left wing, punching through the thin metal. Fuel sprayed from ruptured tanks, igniting instantly in a bright orange flash. The Heinkel rolled left, wing on fire, breaking formation as the pilot fought for control. Nicholson didn't watch it fall. He was already shifting aim to the next bomber in the formation. The defensive fire intensified. Every gunner in the rear Vic was firing at him now. The air around his Hurricane was thick with tracers. He felt more impacts, heard metal tearing somewhere behind his seat. Warning lights flickered on the instrument panel, but the engine kept running strong. His second burst caught a Heinkel in the fuselage just behind the cockpit. The bomber shuddered under the impacts, but maintained formation, though Nicholson saw smoke beginning to trail from the damaged section. A wounded bomber, maybe forced to turn back, maybe not. He'd deal with it if it kept coming. The formation was reacting now. The tight Vics beginning to spread out as pilots instinctively gave themselves room to maneuver. Good, scattered bombers were exactly what Nicholson wanted. He broke hard right, diving away from the rear Vic as their combined fire became too intense. Tracers followed him down, stitching through the space his Hurricane had occupied a second earlier. He pulled up hard, looping around to come at the formation from a different angle. The Germans were talking to each other now, radio chatter filling the frequencies. Nicholson couldn't understand German, but the tone was clear: alarm, confusion. They'd been told British fighters wouldn't attack at night. Their intelligence had assured them the RAF lacked the capability for effective night intercepts. Nicholson came at them again, this time from the starboard side, targeting the Middle Vic. The defensive fire was immediate and coordinated. The German gunners were professionals, their fire disciplined and accurate. Tracers converged on his approach vector, forcing him to break off early. He fired anyway, a shorter burst into the nearest bomber. Hits sparkled along its right wing and engine nacelle. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught fire. The Heinkel maintained formation for a few more seconds, then began losing altitude, the pilot clearly deciding to abort the mission rather than fly over London with an engine fire. 2 confirmed hits, 2 bombers out of formation, 21 remaining. Nicholson's ammunition was half gone, maybe 7 seconds of firing time left. The Hurricane was handling sluggishly now, damage to the control surfaces making it fight him. More warning lights on the panel. Oil pressure dropping slightly. Not critical yet, but concerning. The bomber formation was now completely scattered. The tight defensive boxes broken apart. Individual bombers maneuvering independently. Their formation leader was trying to regroup them. Nicholson could see the lead aircraft firing recognition flares, but the formation discipline was gone. That's when Nicholson noticed something that changed everything. The scattered bombers weren't continuing toward London. They were turning. Not all of them, but enough to matter. 5, 6, 7 bombers breaking off from the main group and heading back toward the Channel. The pilots had decided that continuing the mission with a fighter harassing them was too dangerous, especially with their formation broken and their defensive fire disrupted. 7 bombers returning to France meant roughly 14 tons of bombs that wouldn't fall on London tonight. 14 tons of high explosive and incendiaries that wouldn't rip through apartment buildings, factories and docks. The remaining 14 bombers pressed on, reforming into 2 loose groups. They were determined to complete their mission despite the harassment. Nicholson respected that, even as he prepared to attack them again. His radio crackled, the controller's voice excited. Viper leader, Viper squadron is now on station 5 miles southwest of your position. Nicholson's squadron had arrived. 12 fresh Hurricanes with full ammunition loads diving toward the bomber formation from above. The Germans were about to face a coordinated attack from multiple fighters. The smart move now was to break off, let his squadron handle the rest, and nurse his damaged Hurricane back to base. He'd done his job, scattered the formation, forced some bombers to abort, let the fresh pilots finish it. But Nicholson looked at the 14 bombers still pressing toward London. They were 8 minutes from their drop point. His squadron would intercept in approximately 2 minutes. That meant 6 minutes where these bombers were still heading for their targets. 6 minutes. How much damage could 14 bombers do in 6 minutes? Nicholson checked his ammunition. 5, maybe 6 seconds left. Enough for one more attack. He rolled the Hurricane over and dove toward the nearest bomber group. This attack was different. The Germans knew he was nearly out of ammunition. They could tell by how short his bursts had become. Their defensive fire was more confident, more aggressive. They weren't trying to drive him off anymore. They were trying to kill him. Nicholson came in from directly ahead, a head-on attack that let him use the bomber's own closing speed to reduce his exposure time. The combined closure rate was over 400 mph, giving the German gunners barely seconds to track him. He fired his remaining ammunition in one continuous burst, walking his fire across the lead bomber's cockpit and nose section. Glass shattered, metal peeled away. The bomber's nose dropped suddenly as the pilot was hit. The Heinkel entered a steep dive out of control. Nicholson's guns fell silent, empty. He pulled up hard, rolling right to avoid the crippled bomber. That's when his Hurricane exploded. A German gunner's final burst caught him perfectly. 7.92mm rounds stitched across the Hurricane's fuel tank, directly behind the cockpit. Aviation fuel ignited in a massive fireball that engulfed the entire aircraft. Flames roared through the cockpit. Nicholson's flight suit caught fire instantly. His hands, his face, his legs, everything burning. The pain was indescribable, overwhelming. His oxygen mask melted against his face. The instrument panel in front of him was invisible behind a wall of flame. The hurricane was still flying, still controllable, but it was completely engulfed in fire. Every instinct screamed at him to bail out, to get away from the flames consuming him. But Nicholson saw something through the inferno, a German fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf 110, directly in front of him. The twin-engine fighter was probably providing escort for the bombers, and its pilot hadn't seen Nicholson's burning Hurricane approaching from behind. Nicholson's guns were empty, but the Hurricane itself was a weapon. He pushed the throttle forward, fighting through pain that threatened to make him black out, and rammed the control stick forward. The burning Hurricane dove straight toward the Messerschmitt. The German pilot saw him at the last second and tried to break away, but Nicholson followed, the Hurricane responding sluggishly to his inputs. He wasn't trying to ram the fighter, he was trying to force it into a defensive maneuver that would scatter the bomber formation even further. The Messerschmitt broke hard left, rolling away and diving toward the channel. It worked. The nearby bombers, seeing both the burning Hurricane and their own fighter fleeing, panicked. Two more broke formation and turned for home. Only then did Nicholson bail out. He reached for the canopy release, but the flames had melted his gloves to his hands. The metal handle seared through the charred leather, adding new agony to the overwhelming pain. He pulled anyway, feeling skin tear. The canopy flew away, and the slipstream roared into the cockpit, feeding the flames with fresh oxygen. The fire intensified. Nicholson released his straps and tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond properly. Everything was burning, his entire body engulfed. He pushed himself up through sheer willpower, fighting against the G-forces, the pain and the flames. He cleared the cockpit and tumbled into darkness. The cold night air was a blessing and a curse. It extinguished the flames on his body, but the sudden temperature change on his burns was agonizing. He pulled his ripcord, felt the parachute deploy, and then the pain overwhelmed him. He passed out while still descending. Nicholson woke up lying in a field somewhere in Kent. He'd landed unconscious, crumpling when he hit the ground. A Home Guard unit had found him, drawn by the sound of aircraft crashing nearby and the sight of a parachute descending. The men who found him later said he didn't look human. His face was charred black, his flight suit burned away in places, his hands fused to the melted remains of his gloves. They were certain he was dead until he tried to speak. An ambulance took him to Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead, where the pioneering plastic surgeon Archibald McIndoe ran a specialised burns unit. Nicholson spent the next 14 months there, undergoing multiple surgeries to reconstruct his face and hands. The pain was constant. McIndoe's techniques were revolutionary but brutal, involving skin grafts, reconstructive surgery, and experimental treatments. Nicholson endured it all with the same stubbornness that had driven him to attack 23 bombers alone. While he recovered, the RAF investigated his mission. The initial report from the sector controller confirmed that Nicholson had engaged the bomber formation alone before his squadron arrived. Squadron leader reports confirmed that when they'd arrived on scene, the bomber formation was already scattered, multiple aircraft damaged or aborting. Ground observers reported that only 11 of the original 23 bombers had actually dropped their loads on London that night. The rest had either been shot down or had aborted before reaching their targets. The bombs that did fall were scattered across a wide area, significantly reducing their effectiveness. Intelligence officers did the calculations. Nicholson's solo attack had directly resulted in at least 5 bombers aborting their missions. His continued harassment while he was on fire had scattered 2 more, 7 bombers, roughly 14 tons of explosives and incendiaries that didn't fall on London. RAF analysts estimated that those 14 tons of bombs, if dropped accurately on the East End docks as planned, would have killed between 50 and 100 civilians and destroyed critical infrastructure. On November 25, 1940, while still recovering from his burns, Flight Lieutenant James Brindley Nicolson was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valour in combat. He was the only RAF fighter pilot in the entire Second World War to receive the VC. The citation was extraordinary in its detail. It described his solo attack on superior forces, his continuation of the engagement despite being outnumbered, and most remarkably, his decision to remain in his burning aircraft to make one final attack before bailing out. That last part, staying in the burning Hurricane, was what elevated his actions from extraordinary to legendary. The Victoria Cross isn't awarded simply for bravery under fire. It's awarded for valour in the face of the enemy that goes beyond the call of duty, actions so selfless and dangerous that they inspire others. Nicolson had been under no obligation to continue fighting once his aircraft was on fire. Every regulation, every bit of training, every instinct demanded he bail out immediately. Staying in a burning aircraft for even seconds was potentially fatal. Staying long enough to make one more attack was beyond comprehension. But Nicolson had looked through the flames and seen an opportunity. One more bomber scattered, one more fighter driven off, a few more civilians who might survive the night, and he'd decided that was worth a few more seconds in the inferno. The award ceremony was quiet, held at the hospital. Nicholson's hands were still bandaged, his face covered in dressings. The King's representative pinned the Victoria Cross to his hospital gown while medical staff looked on. Nicolson, never comfortable with attention, reportedly just nodded and asked when he could return to flying. It took 14 months of surgeries and rehabilitation. Mackindow rebuilt his hands well enough to grip a control stick. His face would bear scars for the rest of his life, but he could see, breathe, and speak. That was enough for Nicolson. He wanted to get back in a hurricane. The RAF initially refused. His injuries were too severe. He'd done enough. There were plenty of duties for a Victoria Cross recipient that didn't involve combat flying, training new pilots, public relations, morale tours. Nicolson refused all of them. He'd spent 14 months in hospital while his squadron mates continued fighting. He wasn't going to sit out the rest of the war because of burns. He argued, appealed, and generally made himself such a nuisance that the RAF finally relented. They cleared him for flight duty in February 1942, but not in fighters. His hands, despite Mackindow's brilliant surgery, didn't have quite enough fine motor control for dogfighting. Instead, they assigned him to transport and liaison duties, flying supplies, ferrying aircraft, supporting operations without engaging in direct combat. For most pilots, that would have been acceptable. For Nicolson, it was torture. He watched the war continue without him, watched his former squadron mates fly missions while he transported supplies. He understood the logic. His injuries genuinely made him less effective in combat, but understanding didn't make it easier. In 1944, he managed to get assigned to RAF operations in India and Burma, where the fighting was less intense and the RAF needed experienced pilots even with limitations. He flew transport missions over the Himalayas, one of the most dangerous flying assignments in the war. The mountains, weather, and mechanical reliability issues killed more pilots than enemy action. Nicolson loved it. The challenge of mountain flying, the constant danger, the knowledge that he was supporting combat operations even if he wasn't pulling triggers himself. It wasn't fighter combat, but it mattered. On May 2nd, 1945, 3 days before Germany's surrender, Nicholson's Liberator bomber crashed in the Bay of Bengal during a routine transport flight. The aircraft experienced catastrophic engine failure and went down before the crew could bail out. There were no survivors. He was 27 years old. He He'd survived being shot down in flames, 14 months of agonizing reconstructive surgery, and years of dangerous flying over some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. He died in a transport accident, the kind of random mechanical failure that claimed thousands of airmen during the war. The tragedy of Nicholson's death was compounded by its timing. The war in Europe was essentially over. Japan would surrender 3 months later. He'd survived the darkest days of 1940, the desperate years when Britain stood alone, only to die in an accident after victory was assured. But Nicholson's legacy extended far beyond his death. His solo attack on October 15, 1940, became required study material at RAF training schools. Not because it was tactically perfect. Military analysts could identify multiple points where he'd taken excessive risks, but because it demonstrated something that couldn't be taught in textbooks: initiative, the willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of orders or doctrine. Nicholson's orders had been clear: climb and maintain combat air patrol until the squadron formed up. If he'd followed those orders to the letter, 23 German bombers would have proceeded to London unmolested, dropped their loads on target, and killed dozens, if not hundreds, of civilians. Instead, he'd assessed the situation, recognized that his orders no longer matched the tactical reality, and adapted. He'd understood that sometimes the person in the cockpit, seeing the enemy with their own eyes, has better judgment than controllers watching radar screens miles away. The RAF studied his decision-making process extensively, the moment when he chose to attack alone, the mathematics he must have done, weighing his minimal chances of success against the certain outcome if he did nothing. The cold calculation that even a failed attack was better than no attack at all. Modern fighter pilots learn about Nicholson alongside other famous solo intercepts from the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. His name appears in every comprehensive history of RAF fighter command. The Victoria Cross he earned, the only VC awarded to a fighter pilot in the entire war, makes his story impossible to forget. But what makes Nicholson's story truly remarkable isn't the medal or the tactics. It's what he did after his guns went empty and his aircraft caught fire. Military regulations are explicit about burning aircraft. Bail out immediately. There's no exception for making one more attack. No clause about staying in the cockpit if you see an enemy fighter. Every manual, every training course, every experienced pilot will tell you the same thing. When your aircraft is on fire, you leave immediately. Nicholson stayed. While his body burned, while his flight suit melted, while pain that would have incapacitated most people overwhelmed him, he stayed in that cockpit long enough to scatter 2 more bombers and drive off a German fighter. Why? The Victoria Cross citation doesn't explain his thinking. Nicholson himself never spoke about it in detail. Friends who asked got variations of the same response. There was still work to do. There was still work to do. That simple phrase captures everything about what drove him. The mission wasn't complete. There were still bombers heading toward London, still civilians who needed protecting. The fact that his aircraft was on fire, that he was burning alive, that he'd be lucky to survive the next 60 seconds. Those were problems for later. Right now, there was still work to do. That mindset, that absolute commitment to the mission over personal safety, is what separates valor from recklessness. Nicholson wasn't being reckless. He'd calculated the costs and benefits with remarkable clarity despite the circumstances. A few more seconds in the burning hurricane might kill him, but it would definitely save lives on the ground. The mathematics weren't even close. The burns nearly killed him anyway. 14 months in hospital, multiple surgeries, constant pain, permanent scarring, all from those final seconds before he bailed out. If he'd abandoned the hurricane when it first caught fire, he'd have escaped with minor injuries and probably returned to combat flying within weeks. But those bombers would have stayed in formation. Those civilians would have died. And Nicholson would have known for the rest of his life that he'd chosen his own safety over theirs. That wasn't who he was. Modern aviation doctrine has changed significantly since 1940. Fighter pilots no longer fly solo intercept against massed bomber formations. Air defense is handled by integrated networks of radar, surface-to-air missiles, and coordinated fighter sweeps. The kind of desperate, improvised night intercepts that characterized the Blitz are historical curiosities, not tactical necessities. But the principles Nicholson demonstrated remain relevant. The willingness to trust your own judgment when circumstances demand it, the ability to adapt when orders no longer match reality, the commitment to completing the mission even when personal costs are catastrophic. Every fighter pilot in the RAF learns Nicholson's story. They learn about his decision to attack alone, his tactical approach to breaking up the formation, and his final seconds in the burning hurricane. But more importantly, they learn about the mindset that drove those decisions. The mission comes first, always. Your orders are guidelines for achieving the mission, not rigid instructions that override obvious tactical necessity. If you see the enemy and you're the only one who can engage them, you engage. You don't wait for permission. You don't wait for backup. You assess the situation and you act. That's what Nicholson did. He saw bombers heading for London. He was the only pilot in position to intercept them. The mathematics were simple. Attack now with minimal chance of success, or don't attack and accept certain catastrophe. There was no third option. His legacy extends beyond military circles. Nicholson's story is taught in leadership courses, business schools, and anywhere people study decision-making under pressure. His example illustrates a fundamental truth about leadership. Sometimes the right decision is the one that goes against explicit orders. Not rebellion, not insubordination, but recognition that orders come from imperfect information and that the person closest to the problem often has the best view of the solution. The courage to act on that recognition, even when it means taking full responsibility for the outcome, is what separates followers from leaders. Nicholson demonstrated that courage multiple times in one mission, when he attacked alone, when he continued attacking despite damage, when he stayed in the burning hurricane. Each decision was technically insubordinate, each violated explicit regulations, and each was absolutely correct. The RAF recognized this by awarding him the Victoria Cross rather than court-martialing him. They understood that rigid adherence to regulations in a fluid combat situation was a recipe for disaster. They needed pilots who could think, adapt, and act independently when circumstances demanded it. But they also needed those pilots to be motivated by the mission, not personal glory. Nicholson's actions were selfless in every sense. He gained nothing from attacking those bombers except damage to his aircraft and nearly fatal burns. He wasn't trying to become an ace or win medals. He was trying to keep bombs from falling on London. That motivation made all the difference. A reckless pilot seeking glory would have pressed attacks beyond rationality, wasted ammunition on impossible shots, or stayed in the fight until he was shot down. Nicholson attacked with precision, conserved ammunition intelligently, and only stayed in the burning hurricane long enough to achieve a specific objective. Even burning alive, he was thinking tactically. The civilians whose lives he saved never knew his name. They couldn't. The RAF didn't publicize solo intercepts in detail. Operational security prevented identifying specific pilots or units. The people sleeping in the underground stations and bomb shelters of East London on October 15, 1940, had no idea that a 23-year-old pilot had just attacked 23 bombers alone to protect them. Some of those civilians died anyway. 11 bombers still reached London and dropped their loads. Buildings collapsed. Fires raged. The Blitz continued. One pilot's heroism couldn't stop the larger campaign of terror that Nazi Germany was waging against British cities, but it helped. 14 tons of bombs that didn't fall, dozens of lives saved, dozens of families who went to work the next morning, unaware they'd survived because a pilot they'd never meet had decided to disobey orders. That's the reality of individual heroism in war. Most of it goes unnoticed. Most heroes die without recognition. The civilians they save never know the sacrifice made on their behalf. Wars are won by the accumulated effect of thousands of individual decisions, most of which never make the history books. Nicholson's decision made the history books because he survived long enough to be awarded the Victoria Cross, and because that medal came with publicity that preserved his story. But how many other pilots made similar decisions during the Blitz? How many other solo intercepts disrupted bomber formations? How many other aircraft remained in combat despite damage, buying precious seconds that saved lives on the ground? We'll never know. Most of those pilots died, and their missions were recorded as simple combat losses. Nicholson survived his burns long enough for investigators to piece together what he'd accomplished. That survival, more than the heroism itself, is what made his story famous. But the heroism stands regardless of fame. On October 15, 1940, a young pilot looked at impossible odds, did the mathematics, and decided that some things were worth dying for. Protecting civilians from bombs, disrupting the enemy, completing the mission regardless of personal cost. He didn't die that night, though he came close. He survived to fly again, to continue serving, and ultimately to die in a random accident thousands of miles from the burning hurricane that should have killed him. Life is strange that way. You survive the unsurvivable only to die from something mundane. But those 14 months between the burning hurricane and his return to flight duty changed Nicholson. Friends who knew him before and after the burns reported a subtle difference. He was quieter, more thoughtful, less concerned with regulations, and more focused on outcomes. The pain and isolation of long-term recovery had given him perspective on what mattered. What mattered was the mission. What mattered were the lives you saved, the objectives you achieved, the difference you made. Everything else, regulations, procedures, personal comfort, personal safety, those were negotiable. The mission was not. That philosophy carried him through the rest of the war, through the frustration of being grounded from fighters, through the dangerous Himalayan flights, through the knowledge that his injuries had permanently changed his career trajectory. He adapted, found new ways to contribute, and never stopped looking for opportunities to make a difference. The night of October 15, 1940, defined him. Not the burns, not the medal, but the decisions he made in those few minutes over the English Channel. The decision to attack alone, the decision to continue despite damage, the decision to stay in the burning aircraft for a few more critical seconds. Those decisions saved lives, quantifiably, measurably dozens of lives that would have ended under German bombs. That was worth any price he paid, any amount of pain, any length of recovery, any permanent scarring or limitation, because there was still work to do. There always is, and someone has to be willing to do it, regardless of cost. Flight Lieutenant James Brindley Nicolson, VC, understood that better than most. He lived it, paid for it, and never regretted it. His legacy isn't the medal or the ceremony or the history books. His legacy is the descendants of the people he saved that night, living their lives completely unaware that they exist because a stubborn young pilot once decided that orders were less important than protecting the innocent. Sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is refuse to wait for backup. Not out of recklessness or ego, but because the people who need protecting can't wait. They need action now, not when it's tactically convenient or procedurally appropriate. Nicholson understood this instinctively. When confronted with a choice between doing what he was ordered and doing what needed to be done, he chose the mission over the orders. His legacy lives in every pilot who trusts their own judgment over rigid procedure, who adapts to changing circumstances instead of following plans that no longer fit reality, and who understands that sometimes success means being willing to burn. The next time you face a situation where following protocol seems wrong, where waiting for support means accepting defeat, where the obvious right action violates explicit orders. Remember James Nicholson climbing toward 23 German bombers. He knew the odds, he knew the risks, and he attacked anyway because the alternative was worse.